With both Arkansas senators on board, can the latest repeal attempt succeed? This time, the governor says he's on board as well, but providers wish he would disembark. Two Arkansas giants, two enormous capital investments. Dare we hope it's contagious? And an anniversary. How much and what to celebrate? Arkansas Week, next.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Arkansas Week. Healthcare is at the top of our agenda in this broadcast, as it is at the top of the nation's agenda and the state's. Mr. Kimmel and Mr. Cassidy were invited guests, but both were otherwise occupied. Nonetheless, we're in good hands with Heather Yates from the Political Science faculty at UCA, Benji Hardy, an independent journalist here in Arkansas, Lance Turner, reporter and editor for Arkansas Business, and thanks to everybody for coming in. Benji, where do we start? There's just so much to cover. The estimates of the revenue loss over the next 6 to 10 years anyway to the state in terms of federal health care dollars range from $6 billion to higher. And yet in this case, this time around, this repeal effort, Mr. Hutchinson, Governor Hutchinson, says he's on board. He was openly opposed to the previous attempts.
Right. So, I mean, first off, there are discrepancies between some of the estimates that have been put out there by Kaiser Family Foundation, by Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, which is a think tank out of DC. So there's no hard numbers yet from the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, is what everybody's waiting for, and some of those preliminary estimates perhaps will be ready towards the beginning of next week. But yes, there is agreement that this constitutes a large cut in federal spending to the states. There's one of the interesting things about this proposal, as opposed to some of the previous Republican efforts, is that there's a lot of money being shifted around between states. So the governor said earlier this week this does not constitute a cost shift to the states, and that is why he opposed the previous Senate repeal effort back in July. And he says that this does not constitute such a cost shift to the states. Well, one thing that this bill does do is it takes the existing ACA funds that go out to the states now in the form of Medicaid expansion, in the form of premium tax credits, and it spreads them around. I read one analysis that said it takes half the butter and spreads it over twice the amount of bread. So states such as Texas and Mississippi and Alabama that did not expand their Medicaid programs under Obamacare would actually see a net increase, at least in the period from 2020 to 2026. Now thereafter, from 2026, moving forward, every state would start to see their money decline because of some other changes in the way that traditional Medicaid is affected. But bottom line, yes, Arkansas would see a reduction in its federal dollars coming into the state over the next 10 years, and there's really no getting around that.
Is it fair to say that Mr. Hutchinson is correct when he says it is not per se a cost shift to the states, assuming the state chooses not to pick up the cost?
Well, you have to look at the state. I mean, and you also have to look at the baseline. So, I mean, when the governor says this is not a cost shift, and when Senator Cassidy and Senator Graham say this is not a cut, one of the things that they're talking about is, well, compared to current spending levels. But Medicaid spending goes up and up and up every year.
Sure.
The way that Medicaid is structured is it's a commitment from the government to pay for healthcare costs, whatever those are. And what this bill would do is it would place strict limits on how much the government would pay for it. So there's no, open-ended commitment moving forward, which sounds, okay if you're talking about imposing fiscal discipline, which is sort of what the the line from the governor's office is, but it sounds a lot less good if you're a beneficiary that's seeking care for an expensive treatment that suddenly isn't covered under your state plan.
All right, Heather.
And there's also something to add on to what Benji had talked about too. It's not so much as the Governor Asa Hutchinson says that it's a cost shift to the state. Depends on how you look at that. Is it a cost shift to Arkansas? Not so much. But also the way that this funding structure is being legislated in this proposal is that the federal government is making funds available to state through the mechanism of a block grant. So states have the ability to apply for funds. Doesn't necessarily mean they'll be guaranteed or granted those funds, but then where I think Asa Hutchinson is classifying this is it's not a cost shift to the states. Insurance industries disagree because they think it's a risk shift to the states, and I think that's also worth noting. And states can apply for this funds, and they may not apply. They don't have to apply for this funding as well. So, and then a block grant enables the state to spend the money how they see fit. So the states will then effectively redesign the healthcare system at the state level.
A lot of these plans have had these alternative plans, or these replacement plans have had this block grant component to them, and I think that's what a lot of Republican governors have liked, and that's what you hear a lot of, is that states want more options for exactly how they spend those dollars. They feel constrained under the current system, and they feel like a block grant system will allow them a little more flexibility in exactly how they spend that money. Hospital groups are wary of this, as they have been wary the whole time, because they say there's nothing in any of this in terms of how we address offsetting the cuts to Medicare that have helped fund this Obamacare ACA expansion. That was a key part of that, and hospitals are wondering, well, what's going to replace that? And then also they're concerned about people being uninsured again. We've seen a great reduction in the people who don't have health insurance in the state and across the country, and that's been great for hospitals because uncompensated care has been a thing that they have dealt with forever, and ACA gave them some shelter from that and some relief from that, and they do not want to return to those days. We've got hospitals in the state that are even still banding together, forming partnerships, Baptist and UAMS among them, that are trying to deal, even in this environment, with just the rising cost of healthcare, how healthcare is delivered, how it's staffed. They are under intense pressure anyway, and so I think the thought of undoing the ACA in this way doesn't give them much comfort.
In fact, when you mentioned the Hospital Association, I'm unaware of of course, critics of them will allege self-interest, and that's
certainly
fair enough. But I'm unaware of any health organization or provider organization thus far that supports this Graham Cassidy. I can't think of one. I haven't been able to find one. Including the nonprofits.
No. Right, and the previous, I think the previous attempt that was debated in Congress and ultimately failed. There weren't any takers on that one either. So they have not liked the options so far, for sure.
Yeah, the healthcare industry doesn't like it because it's less money for healthcare.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no way around the fact that. Especially one thing that gets lost, I think, in some of the talk about the block granting and the shifting money to the states, which is all, I mean, the sort of novel components of this bill is a piece that is similar to what was in the previous legislation, the previous repeal effort, which is the cuts to traditional Medicaid, the way that it caps that money being spent. And if you look forward, again, like 20 years into the future, the losses estimated by one healthcare firm, Avalier, are in the range of $60 billion for Arkansas, and I mean, and again, that's partly because the projected growth on Medicaid spending is so large. I mean, it outpaces traditional inflation, but no healthcare group is for it because there's less money for healthcare.
Well, there's this also. We are informed that we're at mid-morning Friday as we tape our broadcast, that the Medicaid directors of all 50, we are told, 50 states have signed a letter in opposition to this repeal. At this hour, I've been unable to confirm whether the Arkansas Medicaid director is in fact a co-signer of that letter. If we find out in the next few minutes, we'll include that in the broadcast as well. But the political implications and the budget implications for the state are pretty significant as this thing moves forward. If it moves forward, they have about 8 days to get this done. There's a timeline on this because of Senate rules.
Once again, there's a, we're jammed up against a timeline, and I think in the past, we've got a timeline, a tight timeline because of these arcane budgeting rules or whatever in the legislature, in Congress. But then also we've got complaints again that we're not following proper procedure in terms of how we pass bills. That was a big complaint of John McCain. That was why he walked out on the floor and did the thumbs down. He didn't like how the sausage was being made. Thought it reflected poorly on the Senate and just
they
how
had
they
other
do business.
reservations as well.
Well, he had other, certainly. And that was a complaint of the governor's as well. He said, we need to get this back into the normal rules process and how we do things. And so now there's once again a rush and a deadline, and we've got to get this done, folks. And I think mainly what it boils down to is that, yes, Republicans think that there's no harm in trying yet again to do this, try or fail, whatever. We got to keep trying because this is a promise we made to the base. The base is very unhappy that we hadn't gotten it done. What do we have to lose in trying to get it done one more time this year?
Well, the strategy has been, to add on to what Lance has said, the strategy has been exactly this. Let's introduce a bill with a very small time frame and try to engage a frenetic strategy of getting something passed using that deadline to pressure people who are undecided and on the votes, on the fence about the votes. And there's some fast and loose politicking with promises being made. And I can speak to at least some of the strategy that's happening at the federal level with some of those holdouts. John McCain was one of them. We know Rand Paul, he votes no every single time because it's just not conservative enough. And then we have Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, and we have Collins from Maine. And right now, the Republican Party is trying to really court Murkowski with some very specific provisions that would affect Alaska and only Alaska to take care of the low-income population, the isolated population of her state. So up against this deadline, strategically up against this deadline so that they don't need their typical 2/3 majority. It's just a simple majority, and that is being difficult to even achieve. And so the pressure of the deadline and trying to then massage these special budgeting rules, and without a CBO report, the whole purpose of the CBO report is to tell our Congress whether or not this legislation is sustainable. And so we have all these soft numbers, and we don't have anything projecting or making any type of conjecture in the future that's even sustainable. So it may be an ideological victory, but I don't think it's going to be a pragmatic victory if it does go through.
Well, because CBO, in some quarters of Congress, CBO estimates are held in very low regard. But anyway, Heather, you used the term promises. If there have been promises, there have also been threats as well.
Oh, sure. We saw that throughout the entire process, starting back in March. The White House issued a threat to Paul Ryan when it was in the House. Vote by Friday. It was that week of a Friday. Vote by Friday, or else we're never really turning back to this. Well, three attempts more. We saw this the first time around in the Senate, that it was made public that Murkowski and Collins were threatened with verbal threats coming from the White House. And so at this juncture, we know the promises are being made. We also know there's a lot of pressure coming down on people. There's a lot of late night phone calls. There's a lot of heated discussions. There's also a lot of threats about congressional seats and elections. This is a year out from the midterms. So there's extraordinary pressure on certain members of the party right now.
It's interesting, though, as far as John McCain goes, previously, his governor of Arizona had said, don't vote for the July iteration of the repeal bill. As did Governor Hutchinson, and the Arizona governor and the Arkansas governor are both supporting this bill. Again, despite the fact that it constitutes less money coming in than would be the case under existing law. And the question is partly why that is the case. It's interesting to me that Governor Hutchinson is interested in going down this route, and I think it says something about his confidence that Arkansas really can do more with less money. He seems to feel that it's worth it for the state to receive this additional authority, even if it means the state losing $2 to $6 billion over the next decade.
I think to build on what you just said, and made the observation, I think it also says something about how many more attempts the Republicans feel that they have on this. They're running out of political capital on this. This is the fourth attempt.
Well, Mr. Hutchinson himself was quoted a couple of days ago saying, this is it.
And I think that's also being reflected in other parts of the Republican Party, is that they may actually believe this is the last ditch effort that they have. This is broken arrow. And so this is, and I think that in some of these interesting positions people are taking that contradict their previous ones, are reflecting that they may actually believe that they've run out of political capital on this.
On to the private sector, always public policy overtones though. Lance, on the heels of the mammoth Amazon announcement, two Arkansas corporate behemoths, Walmart and Bank of the Ozarks, within days of one another, announced enormous capital investments that looks like they're here to stay.
Yeah, good news. I mean, it's nice that that those companies are imagining their futures here in Arkansas. Bank of the Ozarks we'd kind of known about for about a year because they purchased some land out west, and it was known that was what they were going to do, was build a large new headquarters, because they were on top of one another in their current headquarters over on Chenal Parkway. And this week we finally got some new details as to exactly how big it was going to be. CEO George Gleason with the governor alongside Mike Preston of the Arkansas Economic Development Commission announcing a 247,000 square foot campus near the ranch in West Little Rock, which I'm sure makes a lot of people very happy about West Little Rock traffic. But at any rate, because there's going to be about at least 500 people moving into that thing when it opens sometime in 2020. And then it's got capacity to take on 900 people in that place. Bank of the Ozarks is a fast-growing Arkansas bank, and it is one of the big Arkansas business success stories. George Gleason has built that bank from a bank with $300 million in assets in 1997 to one with $20 billion in assets today. And he is a shrewd businessman, and I think one of the iconic figures in Arkansas business, just in terms of how he has built that company into one that looks strong and set to last. Of course, there's always a bigger dog in the neighborhood, and so Walmart is that bigger dog, of course, in terms of sizes of companies. And Walmart has been in its same headquarters since about 1971, more or less. I'm not sure that there's been a lot of improvements made inside and around that building. I'm sure a lot of people would. Who's been inside that building before and kind of know how it is.
Institutional.
Yes, institutional. Not a lot of carpet, not a lot of natural light, a lot of wood paneling on the walls. I think it's that was the Sam Walton era. And
yeah,
it was famously frugal, and so there weren't a lot of bells and whistles. There was no free lunches. There was no free cereal for employees like they get at Google or whatever. But that raises an interesting angle on this, because Walmart now is a different company than it was. It's in a different era. It is fighting companies like Amazon that are born of e-commerce and born on the web and just have a different culture and idea about what a workplace is and what a company can be. And so Walmart has to remake itself a bit. And so this could be an interesting opportunity to see exactly what they do in a headquarters, because these kinds of workplaces are big recruiting efforts. They say a lot about a company. I mean, you look at Apple's $5 billion spaceship campus out in Silicon Valley, and think about Walmart that has a presence in Silicon Valley. They're all trying to recruit the same tech, and that's the kind of companies they're going up against, are the Apples and the Amazons and the Googles of the world. At any rate, it's great news that they're building here in Arkansas. Walmart's going to spend the next 5 to 7 years putting this plan together. They're going to consolidate a lot of offices. They got a lot of folks spread out right now. They're going to go to the AEDC in the state to get some incentive dollars. It's good news that they're here. How they use this space and what they do is going to be just fascinating to watch.
It raised some eyebrows that Walmart, with 280 million employees or whatever it is, was going to go to the state for the incentive money that you looked at.
Yeah, and Bank of the Ozarks went too and got some tax credits and some relatively minor incentives, or kind of the usual batch that the AEDC hands out. And what George Gleason says is that we are all over the country now, and they are. They've gotten bigger. They're throughout the Southeast. They're in New York. He says, I've got a duty to my shareholders to get the best deal I can. And that'll be Walmart's same story, is that we're a global company. We could build literally anywhere, and so they're gonna ask for some advantages for sure.
Give us a quick snapshot if you can. Where is it? We've got stock market setting right, a little bit of a stumble on the Friday morning anyway, but Despite North Korea, despite all the other, despite the upheaval, the chaos in Washington, the stock market just keeps going up. The Fed's going to meet in a few weeks. Middle class incomes, it is reported, are showing some appreciable gains anyway. They're not stellar, but they're solid anyway. What's the fallout? What's the shakeout? What's the bottom line here?
Well, I mean, I think the bottom line is that we've got a good recovery that's taken hold. It's
jobless rate in Arkansas, I should mention, still at a
record. The national jobless rate, let's see, 4.4%. That's a 16-year low. So things are going well. I think this report out of the census, the median household income in the United States at $59,039 is a record, and it's also up like 8.5% over the last 2 years. So that's good news for the country, where there's been this, I think, unease that the middle class has sort of been hollowed out and forgotten and left behind. It's been particularly susceptible to the changes in just how people work and automation and technology that's replaced a lot of, long-time manufacturing, middle class, bread and butter type jobs. So any kind of strengthening that we see in the middle class is good news. In terms of the stock market, there's all kinds of, there are people who'll say it's a fiction in terms of where the stock market is today, because there's a lot that goes into that. The thing that bears watching is the Federal Reserve. In December, they are signaling they could start raising rates again and maybe raise rates even more throughout 2018. That's going to depend on a host of factors. They're watching inflation. They're watching the jobless rate still. I think there is the feeling that things are still a little fragile, and they don't want to do anything to upset the cart. You've also got, whether Janet Yellen, who's the head of the Federal Reserve, whether she's going to stick around for some of that, and those personnel changes that could affect some philosophies and how the Fed handles money. But right now, things look and feel better than they have, and they feel pretty good in Arkansas. I mean, we're pretty much at full employment, statistically speaking, and so that's a better thing, certainly from the recession days of 2008 and in between.
And finally tonight, the only president from Arkansas will return to Arkansas in a few hours, a couple of days, to address a commemoration at Central High School, the 50th.
60th. 60th.
60th, I'm sorry. Well, correction, the 60th. And as he did 20 years ago, I think, or 20 years ago, on the 40th. It evokes mixed feelings in different people. Everyone, of course, wants to tip the hat to the Little Rock Nine and to the courage that was displayed in 1957. But there are also some questions being raised about, well, where are we? Where's this system now? Still under state control.
Right. I mean, there are plenty of people in Little Rock who are longtime advocates of Little Rock schools that are not pleased about this celebration. I mean, in short, because they see that it comes at a time when Little Rock schools are being threatened in a way almost existentially that like never before. Partly because of the state takeover, which is now in its second year, well into its third year, and partly because of the rise of charter schools in the city. Just last week, the State Board of Education approved 3 new charters to come to Little Rock. Or I should say they declined to review a previous decision. So
tantamount to.
Essentially, yes, giving the final go-ahead. And somewhat remarkably, you had the Little Rock superintendent, Mike Poore, up there in front of the state board arguing against the charters. And that's, I say remarkable, not because it's unusual for a superintendent to be opposed to charter schools coming into his district. That's what one would expect. But a year ago, his predecessor, Baker Curris, lost his job as superintendent, and widely perceived in part because of his outspoken stance against charter expansion. Mike Poore was appointed by the Commissioner of Education, Johnny Key, to run the Little Rock District, and he has, and by almost all accounts from the state board members, he's done a fine job, and yet he could not convince them to put the brakes on some of this expansion of charters and let the district have time to sort of show its own results, as he put it. And I thought he made a convincing case in terms of presenting some data saying that if you look at the Little Rock schools and the poverty rates in those schools, like we are making gains. We've made some progress on test scores that the last round of data that just came in. But in the end, the state board said, no, thank you. We're going to approve these charters anyhow.
Well, 60 years after 57, yeah, the schools are integrated, but the racial ratios have just totally reversed.
Yeah, and it depends on what you mean by integrated. It depends
Yeah.
on what standard you're using. Certainly there are, you don't have school campuses that are designated explicitly white and explicitly black, but if you look at the makeup of individual schools, you do see a disturbing sort of resegregation, both along racial and poverty lines, more than anything. The most disturbing development, I think, is there's so many campuses where there's such a high concentration of children from high poverty homes that it just makes the challenges within those schools so much greater than in schools where it's more of a socioeconomic mix.
Got to end it there because we're out of time. Thanks to everyone for coming in. Thanks, as always, to you for watching. See you next time.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.